channel that John's created to go and view these virtual meetings. So please look at those, and if you need a link to the channel, contact John, but it's a really convenient way to view previous meetings. Wes, are you ready for roll call?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's kick it off.
All right, Alabama,
South Maddox,
Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa,
Warren Jones,
Kentucky,
John Bunges,
Louisiana,
Jason Olzak,
Manitoba,
Jillian St. George,
Michigan,
Barbara Evers,
Minnesota,
Nate Huck,
Mississippi,
Houston Havens,
Missouri, Ohio,
Mike Irvin,
Ontario,
Rod Brook,
Saskatchewan,
Catherine Conkin,
Tennessee, Wisconsin, Canadian Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service,
Dave Scott,
Bird Banding Laboratory, USDA APHIS Wildlife Services, USGS. Anybody want to introduce any guests?
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of them to introduce, looks like.
Go for it.
So for the first time, we have joining us Dr. Joseph Marty, replacing Heath Hagee. I think Hagee's on here too. And we got Pam and Kathy, and I guess I can claim Bortner too.
Great. Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Heath, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Any other introductions?
Minnesota has Bruce Davis,
Hey, Bruce.
Callie's here for Kentucky, and Wes Little is here for Kentucky.
Bowling's here for Louisiana.
I'll introduce Derek Ballard, from DU from Iowa. Okay, well, hearing no further introductions, I'll just provide a brief overview of our agenda. The only modification I have is we're going to defer the Iowa presentation until December. So we're not going to cover that topic today, but otherwise we'll start with an update from Dave Scott, and then we'll hear from Kathy Fleming and Brad Bortner about HIP. Then we'll hear from Ariel about King Rails in Arkansas. Lastly, Paul Link about our MFC banding station. And then hopefully we'll have some discussion on the timing of the future summer meeting. Does anybody have any additions to the agenda? Okay, well, hearing none, I'll turn over to Dave for our update from the Fish and Wildlife Service. Take it away, Dave.
All right. Well, I know you had several things listed, so I'll just touch on things, and if you have questions, you can follow up. But one of them had to do with the release of the reports, and therefore it will probably come under consideration later in your agenda when you talk about timing of summer meeting. But Ken sent out a memo last month identifying that Fish and Wildlife Service commitment to getting those reports out needed to be changed and updated based on the capacity and, you know, the relatively high burden on the remaining staff, which I'm sure Pam and Kathy and others can attest to. but committed to having some of the status reports out by the 1st of September on an annual basis and having the AHM report out and some of the recommendation memos by the 5th of September on an annual basis. So that obviously affects when we can have our meeting, and we won't want to have, regardless, the scenario we had this summer, which was a little tough, having the reports come out while we're already meeting in Illinois. So that's one topic. I've heard from several of you on emails that I have shared. One had to do with a draft policy memo on defining rifles and that whole issue with air guns and things, asking you to run through your system with your folks, with law enforcement, et cetera, to see if you had any issues, concerns, comments on what was drafted. You know, receiving that between now and when we meet next month is fine. I've heard from several of you, and I've just been gathering those comments. And so if you have something else to add, please send it to me, and I'll pass those on to law enforcement at some point here early, in this quarter. So probably November, December. The other issue had to do with, you were reminded, we talked about this at the summer meeting, had a little illustration of the electronic data and HIP books. And Oren reminded you to take a look at that, spend some time on it. I've heard from several of you. Appreciate the comments we've received. Those things have been passed on to Todd Sanders and Steve Olson. Many of those suggestions for improvement or little errors have been addressed already. So as you go back in and load a newer version, it'll probably reflect those changes. But if anybody has any additional comments or opportunity to look at that and you haven't, please do so. Please let me know if you find anything else that needs a quick fix. Todd's been pretty fast about getting on those things, and I found it to be very helpful. The comments I've received from you guys have been that it's a very nice resource to have. It will be updated every time there's new data. So with that in mind, let me know. In terms of the regulation process, the normal process, we have the preliminary for the 25-26 season drafted and in review. It is currently with OMB and OIRA. It could be there for up to another couple of months, but anticipating, before the end of the year that's going to be published, and I'll let you know when I know for sure. We have drafted probably 90% of the proposed. We will finish that up after we've had an opportunity to go through the SRC meeting, which is scheduled for Tuesday, the 19th of November. So some decisions will need to be made. That will be reflected in the proposed, and then it will continue through the process. The new policy memo procedure, Federal Register documents, is still moving. Currently, that draft document is with the solicitor, and can't tell you exactly when, but I believe it will continue moving forward. At some point, it'll get published, and we get an opportunity for you to review that and comment whenever that happens. No idea if it will be through the process enough to use for the 25-26 season. We could switch in the middle of this process if that was available. Likely it won't be done in time and we'll have to use it for the following year, but it still has to go through. So things are moving. And I know those were a lot of the things that you had listed for me to address, and I can take any questions, Oren, that you or others have.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Any questions for Dave?
So Dave, based on the feedback, you think that Todd will continue to work on that data book and update it for us?
Yeah, I believe he's already addressed the things that you sent me.
Yeah, they're changed already. Yep.
Yep. And I had forwarded your note to Steve Olson also, so he was aware of those things, but I think Todd addressed them right away because they were pretty, simple fixes, but he really appreciated the fact that you went into the detail that you did. so they can work those bugs out. And I've had several other ones. I think, well, I know Oren spent some time with it, Adam did. So whenever I've gotten comments, I forwarded those along. And they just keep making the changes as we go. And so, every little bug that they fix makes it better.
Dave, question in that regard. Will there be a new file shared every year, or is it the same hyperlink that is just updated? The code and the data sets are just updated behind the scenes, and there won't be a new file, if you will, to share every year.
Best to my knowledge, Oren, what happens is it'll be the same link, but when you go in and download the most current version, it will include any new data that have been made available. So when I'm aware, like we get into the summertime period and we have the HIP data and those things available, I'll let you know. But at the present time, I believe it's the same link, and if something changes, I'll get you new links.
Or on there, based on the changes Todd made yesterday, it shows the latest update time. So if you download a version of it, you did it on September 1st. If it now says October 1st update, then you need to download a new one to have the latest version. So I'd assume, unless you were in it after about lunch yesterday, there's a newer version that the pintail portion had the dove data in the pintails. So Todd fixed that, and so it's all anyway. So that got changed about lunchtime yesterday, I think.
Yeah, so just check the date that's listed on the files, and you'll know whether you need to download something for simple fixes. But there's got to be once or twice a year you're going to get big slugs of new data.
I think it's a tremendous improvement, Dave. I'm really excited about it. I think it makes the data much more usable and easily digestible. I think it's a major improvement.
Yep, hats off to Todd and Steve and those who worked on that behind the scenes to make it happen.
That's just my one thing I might say to folks using it is just look at if you use the graphics, look at the table versus the graphics. There's 1,000 things Todd and Steve did there, and it's easy to mess a link up. So make sure that graphic, you can pretty easily look and see, okay, the plots on this graph are matching the table. And if they aren't, then like I said, Todd had it fixed in less than an hour probably. So anyway, it's just worth looking at before you use it for some kind of public event.
Any other questions for Dave?
And it looks like Frank joined us, so you might be able to see if he has an update also.
Hey, Dave, I have a question for you before we let you go. Has the SRC meeting been scheduled?
Yes. It is noon to 5 on Tuesday, November the 19th. I've checked in with Todd. I know Todd's available, and Joe had a conflict. I don't know if he's worked that out yet or not, but I'll be reaching out to the two of them to see if we need to chat ahead of time.
Okay, great. So that'll be the day before our next meeting, right? Our next virtual. Yeah. Okay. Would you be willing to give us an update, an overview of the SRC meeting next month then?
Sure.
Great. Okay. All right. Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Frank, do you have anything to share with us, or are you pretty much good to go here?
Hey, Oren. Yeah, sorry for joining late. I'm just on the road here today. The only thing I'd like to say is that Josh Dooley and I did a VU podcast with Mike Brazier the other day about Arctic goose productivity. And if folks want the latest estimates from the fall survey that we do in Prairie Canada, and then kind of a general summary of other Arctic productivity, then they could tune into that latest podcast.
Thanks for
the free plug, Frank. Man, I wasn't expecting that.
Shameless, eh?
Hey, I will tell everybody else here that that kind of episode does really, really well. So several thousand downloads in the first week or so and all that kind of stuff. So information gets out there, and we try to highlight the work that try not too technical stuff, but try to educate folks on what y'all are doing.
Sounds like a good one. Thanks for making us aware, guys. Okay, let's keep moving along. And next on our agenda, Kathy Fleming with an update on HIP.
Hi
Whenever
there.
you're ready, Kathy, feel free to
Okay.
take it away.
Thanks. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep, looks good, Kathy.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to come back. It's kind of a follow-up from the presentation I gave at the winter meeting. And so some similar topics, but I did want to especially spend some time talking about this year's harvest estimates. And so I'm going to cover that. First, if you have any questions, feel free to just interrupt me, because I'm going to be going through a bunch of slides just to show you. And it's probably a lot of slides. I might go through them quickly, but I did this before for the central flyway, and it's more so that I can give you the slides afterwards and you'll have a record of the plots, because I think that makes it a little bit easier. And sorry, I still have a cold from COVID, so I'm eating cough drops. All right, so I'm quickly going to review this year's waterfowl, mostly just ducks and dove estimates, and focus on the Mississippi Flyway. Probably you all had a chance to look at the report and see that the estimates are, for the most part, a great deal higher than they have been in the past, although it's not true for every state and every species or species group. I'm going to also talk about what we mean by preliminary estimates and the reason that we put preliminary estimates in our annual report. But what I do want to cover is just a overview of the changes that we've made to the harvest survey over the last 2 years and also this past year, and some ways that those changes might have impacted our survey estimates. Then I'm going to review a little bit. I talked about this the last time, which was the sources of bias in the harvest survey, but I'm going to focus on non-response bias for reasons that'll become evident a little bit later, and also some of the possible ways that we can evaluate non-response bias in the survey. And I'll end just by kind of providing a segue for Brad to talk about opportunities for a multi-state wildlife grant to study some of these issues. All right, so here's the plot of the time series for the U.S. duck harvest estimates, with the most recent obviously being this past year, 23-24 season. So in the U.S., the duck harvest estimate went from about 8.2 million to about 14.7 million. It's about an 80% increase in that year. And also, I think most of you are probably familiar with last year's estimates, which were pretty low, following kind of a general decreasing trend, at least on the flyway level. In the Mississippi Flyway, we had the same large increase, going from about 3.4 million ducks to 6.3 million ducks, which is about an 85% increase. In the red here, I think some of you may have seen these plots before. That is the number of HIP registrations that we receive. In this case, it's for across the Mississippi Flyway. So you can see that over time, there has been a trend in declining HIP registrations. Some of that is real. Some of that is a product of us getting better at detecting people who are registered for HIP who should not be, and working with states to resolve some of their licensing processes that end up registering hunters for HIP who may be like deer hunters or small game hunters. So it's not necessarily showing an alarming trend in the reduction of the number of hunters registering for HIP. Right, so obviously that's a pretty big increase, and I thought this might help to show that across the states, the increase is pretty much evenly distributed. So the pie chart on the left shows the previous hunting season, and you can see in this past hunting season, that the proportions of that total harvest are pretty similar to the preceding year. There was a little bit of a change in Tennessee increased, Louisiana increased their proportion, Arkansas decreased a little bit, but for the most part, it's remarkably similar. So there's no one state or a few states that are driving this increase. And I'm saying increase, but we're talking about preliminary estimates, which I'll explain more. I'm not saying necessarily that harvest increased. I'm saying that the estimates of our harvest have increased. This is the active hunter estimate for the Mississippi Flyway. Went from about 340,000 to about 477,000, which is about a 41% increase. And you see a very similar pattern in the time series as harvest. And then this is the breakdown of active hunters by state in the Mississippi Flyway. And again, see pretty similar the previous year to last year, pretty similar breakdown in terms of active hunters by state. And then duck days hunted, number of days hunted, shows the same pattern. The number of days hunted went from about 1.5 million to 3.5 million. But I thought what was interesting, I don't have it here, but is if you take the total number of days and divide by the total number of hunters, so days per hunter, more or less, we didn't really see much of an increase. So I just calculated that, and this past year was about 7.3 days per hunter. And compare it to the previous 3 years, which was 4.5 days, 6.7 days, and then 7.1 days in 2020. So it's really not that far out of the range of historical values. That's the number of days, average days per hunter. And so we don't generate a bag per hunter estimate over the US or by flyway. And the reason for that is because hunters hunt in more than one state and more than one flyway. So our estimates of active hunters are usually overestimated, or excuse me, are usually overestimated. The actual number would be less. But what I wanted to show here is that when we look at harvest estimates, so when we're generating preliminary estimates and we're looking at them, spend a lot of time looking at the time series, looking at state by state estimates for each of the species group, looking for anomalies. And when you think about big jumps or big decreases in the number of hunters or the number of, or the estimates of harvest, sometimes those kind of clue you in that it could be a problem with the sample frame. Like if we didn't include all the hunters that year, if a couple states didn't send us all their hunters, we can usually identify and work to correct things like that. But one of the best indicators of the quality of the data is looking at the bag per hunter, because the bag per hunter estimate should be relatively stable, barring some very large change to our regs. There's not a lot of across the board increases in bag per hunter that we see in our time series for any species. And so interestingly enough, looking at this year, which showed those very large increases in harvest and active hunters, we don't see such a huge increase in bag per hunter. I'm just going to page through the states in the Mississippi Flyway, and you can see there are increases. They're pretty much, in line with increases that we've seen, and probably less than some of the increases we've seen going back through periods that might have had different hunting regulations. These are just scrolling through states by alphabetical order. And you can see that some show very little increase at all. And one of the things this does is it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about there being like a widespread serious error in our data. This is Minnesota, Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio. and Tennessee and Wisconsin. So you can see that the bag per hunter estimates are not showing that same across the board increase. Okay, so switching to mourning doves, I'm just going to show you a couple plots for mourning doves. Mourning dove harvest estimate in the US went from about 8.3 million to 16.7 million, about doubled. Our estimates did this year. You can see the same, it's the same HIP registration time series because it's the same hunters. It's just basing it on a different question about the number of doves that the hunter shot, not the number of ducks. So in the central management unit, the increase was from about 4 million to 9.2 million, which is more than double. In the eastern management unit, it was 3.2 to 6 million, so about 87%. So these estimates are not completely outside the range of historical possibility, but it's a very large increase in a single year, obviously. And again, it's following a year where we saw some pretty substantial decreases in that decreasing time series. All right, so I'm talking about preliminary estimates here. So first of all, I want to explain why we call them that and why we do it this way. So obviously, the way that we make decisions in harvest management is we have a regulation cycle, and the cycle is gathering data, producing estimates, and then making decisions based on those estimates for the upcoming harvest season. So we obviously have moved our harvest season decision making a year in advance now, but we're still on the same regulation cycle in terms of making the decision. It's just that the decision applies to a year later's harvest season, not the current year's harvest season. So we obviously need this information to make those decisions. We use harvest estimates for mallard, for geese, for pintail, scaup, dove, woodcock, and some other species as well. And I know the states use them too. So we're collecting data from the survey. It closes in June. We found that we actually do get, we send out end of season reminders that start at the end of the hunting season, and we continue them for several weeks afterwards. So we're actually getting submissions into June. And that means that our final pull of the harvest estimates is going to happen once we close the survey, which I think was like June 15th this year. That doesn't mean we don't start estimating. I usually do a poll in March. I've been doing, and one of the great things about having the online survey is that we don't have to wait for all the data to be scanned and entered and double checked. You know, they're entered right into the database. Once we get that final poll in June, the estimates have to be published in August. So what can we accomplish during that time? It allows us to review the HIP sample frame in each state. And we also start doing that in March. It's hard to do it earlier. Well, I guess we started in about January, but it's hard to do it earlier because, you know, we're getting registrations every 2 weeks. And so, especially in some states where they have later seasons, you're getting a bulk of registrations. You can't really make any decisions about missing data, you know, especially that you can't identify by looking at the issue dates until you pretty much have the bulk of the HIP data. So we're reviewing the sample frame. We're going back to the states if we have problems and trying to resolve those problems. We're cleaning the diary survey data. A lot goes into that. We're looking for party hunts, you know, serious overbags that look like they might be like season totals disguised as like daily totals. We're looking for nonsense values like worthless data, and we're cleaning that diary survey data, which takes actually a fairly long time to get through. We're also cleaning the PCS data, the parts collection survey data, because as you probably know, we use the parts allocation to come up with those species specific waterfowl harvest estimates. And so that PCS data, that's all entered by the speciators, and then there's a second entry that takes place by our clerks, and then there's a reconciliation that happens, and then Bob puts it into the database, so that takes some time too. And then the allocation of waterfowl harvest weights to come up with those harvest estimates, that's a pretty quick operation, but it takes place after all of this. What it doesn't allow us to do is a thorough review of the sample frame. And that is, we can look for missing dates in the distribution of issue dates that we get from the states. But it's really difficult for us to track down some of the other problems, like if we get a lot of extras, if we get a lot of duplicates that are different in one respect, like maybe issue date or how they answered the survey, it's difficult for us to detect those sometimes. What it really doesn't allow us to do is evaluate bias and even further to correct for that bias. So there's quite a few different potential sources of bias. I'm going to focus on non-response bias here, but that's not something we can do within our operational cycle at this point. All right, so I've talked about how we've implemented the online harvest survey. In 2019, we started using it experimentally alongside the paper survey. It became operational in 2022-23. We did a comparison. I have a report that's available. I think I summarized that during the winter meeting, your winter meeting. 23-24 is the second year of our operational survey. So I'm not going to go through all of this here, but I just think, keep in mind, we've had 2 years to implement this operational online survey. And if you look, these are this is a short list of all of the changes that we have made. So first I'll say, in our defense, is some of these changes were required, that we did not have an option of deciding that we were going to put them off or not do them at all. Some of them were required by us because we knew that it would improve the information that we were getting. We found problems with the survey and we knew we had to make it better or fix those problems. But the other thing I want to mention about this is that when we started down this road of doing an online survey, we never, at no time did we say to ourselves that what we want to do is exactly duplicate the existing time series in the harvest survey. And a lot of people might say, well, why not? Why didn't you want to do that? Well, because when faced with a choice of improving the survey, improving the methodology, improving our ability to collect quality data, or sticking with what we had, we always will go to improving. And so we realized that at some point we might be uncoupling the survey estimates from the historical time series. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm just saying that when you look at all the changes we made, that's what the thought process was. And I guess you can argue with that, whether or not that was the right thing to do, but we did know that there were some improvements that we needed to make. Okay, so what I want to focus on here is the changes that have been made in 2022, 23, and 24. And I just put 24 in there because, we thought we were done making changes, and then Google comes along and says, hey, you're a bulk email sender. If you don't put a one-click unsubscribe functionality in your emails, then we will stop delivering your emails. And Yahoo said the same thing. So we were forced to do that, which may have some impact on the survey responses as well. I'm going to talk about these in the next couple of slides, so I'm not going to go over them right here. All right, so obviously we had very different estimates this year, and I want to discuss the factors that could have affected this year's estimates. This is a partial list, but these are the ones I think are important to communicate. First of all, we only use submitted responses rather than both submitted and unsubmitted. So you have a paper survey, you send it in, we get it, that's a submitted response. In our online survey, you can enter data and not submit the data. It's still in our database. It just hasn't been submitted. We send you end of season reminders to remind you to submit. Some people never do. We looked at the difference between submitted responses and unsubmitted responses, and we found that unsubmitted responses were much lower. And so given the fact that we had a very good sample size this year, we decided only to use the submitted responses. I went back and used both of them, and it had a very minor effect on the estimates. I think it was like maybe 1% on waterfowl estimates. So I don't think it was, there were not that many unsubmitted responses, but they were substantially different. We increased the sample size. I think I talked about this before. We actually did this the previous year. We increased our sample size in Stratum 1 based on the recommendations of Dave Otis and then some work that Dave did with Emily Silverman, our statistician. We chose an optimal sampling allocation, which means that even though Stratum 1 is a huge stratum, and again, Stratum 1 is those hunters, the less avid hunters. Those are hunters that answered the HIP question, no, I didn't hunt last year, or I hunted, but I didn't shoot anything. So there's a lot of non-hunters in Stratum 1. Usually it's about like 10 times or even 20 times the size of the more avid strata. And in the paper survey, they never had the budget to sample the same sampling rate for Stratum 1, but we're doing mostly an email survey, so we increased the sample size to be the same as in the other strata. We made changes to the online survey application. We were facing a mandate from our parent agency, DOI, to implement multi-factor authentication, which means something you have, like a card, computer card, and something you know, like a password. We were required to implement that through login.gov. We were very worried that our low response rates would get even lower because we had had a lot of hunters complaining about having to log in at all. But after consulting with our IT, we realized that if we removed the account login, then we would no longer be required to implement MFA. The reason being that we're not validating hunters. So essentially what we did was we replaced the account login with a 10-digit invitation code, which means that yes, you could give it to your brother-in-law and he could enter data for you, but that's how we always had the paper survey. So we email out the invitation code, it goes to the recipient, or we send them a paper invitation with the invitation code printed on it. We also removed the did not hunt button from the email. We had a kind of fast track way of people who did not hunt to tell us. All they had to do is click on a button in the email and that would be their survey response. We removed that because we required the account functionality to allow that functionality in the email. 4, we changed the survey invitation design. So previous to this past year, we sent out end of season reminders to hunters who had registered for our survey or who had entered partial data. This year, we sent end of season reminders to everyone who we had an email address for. And so that means that where we were sending out maybe 20% of our recipients were getting full 3 end of season reminders. Now, every single person who had an email, whether or not they ever logged on, didn't matter. They were getting end of season reminders. So a couple of factors that could have been responsible for affecting the year's estimates. We could have made a list, and I spent about 3 months going through some of these and looking at some analysis, making sure that we were checking all of our work. We did some really extensive looking, and Nathan Zimfer and Bob Raftovich took about 2 or 3 weeks and went through every part of our database, all the code that's used to process the data, all my code, all the code that pulls the HIP data in, and checked it. We actually did find a couple errors. They weren't errors, they were errors that needed to be fixed that were in the relational database. They did not affect this particular issue, but it made me feel good that we were able to uncover some errors. So they were definitely looking at every table in the database and all the code. They did not find anything that could have been responsible for this. Another reason that could have accounted for the very large change from last year to this year is that previous year's estimates, those last year estimates, could have been biased low. That also could apply to the previous time series, although in some cases the estimates we had this year were comparable to earlier in the time series. One possibility is that hunters actually harvested more birds this year, or that there were more hunters hunting this year. Now, all the anecdotal evidence, and believe me, we talked to a lot of people. We talked to some states that had their own harvest estimates, did not bear this out. So hunters were not reporting harvesting a lot more birds this year. As far as more hunters hunting this year, I don't know, other than state estimates or maybe license sales, how we might get at some of that data, but there was no anecdotal information to support that. All right, so for the rest of this, I just want to talk about these 3 factors, because I think these are probably responsible for at least part of the big swing and increase in estimates that we saw this year. Okay, before I do that, I'm going to talk about non-response bias, just to jog your memory. Non-response bias is a type of bias that you can see in a self-selected survey where some people respond and some people don't. And you get a bias when the people who respond are different than the people who don't respond in terms of the thing that you're measuring. So here it's hunting activity. And that could be a couple different things. One, we could have different response rates between the people who went hunting and those who didn't hunt. And you can easily come up with reasons why that might be. You know, people who did not hunt, maybe they just don't care about the survey. Maybe they're not migratory bird hunters, so they don't know what we're talking about. You know, the different burden of responding from people who are avid hunters, having to enter a lot of data, especially if they do their daily summaries rather than season totals, versus someone who just presses a button that says, no, I didn't hunt. There's also different response rates for hunters of different avidity. So just as I said, we have strata that are based on avidity. So if we have responses in the high avidity strata, response rates that are different from those in the low avidity strata, and those could be linked to differences in hunting activity. Ideally, this should be accounted for by our stratification estimation. So that's why we're using these stratified weighted estimates. But there are exceptions to that. So there's 2 studies. I think I mentioned these last time. Atwood is the earlier study. It was a male survey, I think in Missouri. Found no evidence of non-response bias in the diary. This is a diary survey that was based on comparing what hunters remembered, I think a year after, or maybe 6 months after they actually hunted. And those same hunters actually had to report at the refuge on the day of the hunt what they harvested. So they had something to compare it against, and they didn't see any differences. Christy Wilkins, when she was branch chief of our branch, she did a certified mail survey. That was just take a proportion of the respondents and send them a certified mail survey that they had to go pick up at the post office and fill out. And so those people had a much higher response rate, and she didn't see any difference in harvest estimates. All right, but what are the effects, the potential effects of what I just talked about in terms of potential changes in non-response bias? And that's what this slide is trying to. These are suggested or proposed because we're not able currently to measure the degree of non-response bias. So we increased stratum 1, the non-avid sample size, overall increase to 5% sample rate. The design changes I talked about, we got rid of the account creation. We made it easier to access season totals. So if you didn't want to enter every day you hunted, you could just go right to season totals. And we got rid of those hunted or did not hunt buttons in the invitation. And also the survey invitation reminder changes, as I mentioned already, we sent them to all hunters with email addresses last year. We also eliminated the 4th paper invitation to hunters with emails, but that was based on the fact that we did not see any higher response with that paper invitation. So the impact could be from increasing the stratum 1 sample size. And we did see increased precision, which was one of the reasons for doing it. But it could compensate for imperfect stratification, which means if you have a bunch of people that aren't really non-avid hunters in there, and you end up sampling a lot more of them, then you could end up with a higher estimate of harvest for that stratum. We did see an increase in active hunters from 13% to 22%, not quite double, just in that stratum. And that could definitely be a response to that higher sampling rate. Online survey design changes. So we got really good positive feedback from hunters, especially avid ones, when we got rid of the account login requirement. They really liked that. The removal of the did not hunt button may have done the opposite though. Instead of increasing, it might have, not only did we get an increase in response rate from avid hunters, but we possibly decreased our response rate from non-hunters. So they don't see a did not hunt button. They're like, I don't want to take this. They just didn't respond. That could actually shift the non-response bias. It doesn't mean that the old survey, the paper survey, didn't have non-response bias. It just means that it could change the degree of non-response bias. And then survey invitation reminder changes did increase end of season response rates, and most of those were people who hunted. There was a very small response from people who didn't hunt. So we didn't get a lot of end of season like, oh, I didn't hunt. Most of the people that responded at the end of the season said that they hunted. And this illustrates what that possibly means. So here I have two sets of response rates. One is to the initial invite. So when we first send out the survey to people, we get about a 4% response rate from people who are hunting. And that makes sense. You know, we're sending them out as soon as we get the HIP registration. Maybe it's like a quarter of the way through the season, you know, so it's 4%. It's not very much. We get an 8% response rate by did not hunt, which also makes sense. If you know you're not going to hunt, you respond right away. All right. And so look at the end of season reminders. You see that the response rate from did not hunts and hunted is about the same. All right. So imagine if we did not send the end of season reminders. So we take away that additional response that's at the end of the season. And what we're taking away is almost entirely, or for the most part, it's the same amount of people who hunted and people who did not hunt. But what that leaves us with is a very biased response of people who hunted and did not hunt from the initial invitations. And what that means to me is that there is a big potential there that the change we made to increase the number of end of season reminders and send them to all hunters who had an email address could have ended up shifting the non-response bias towards a greater response by people who hunted. All right, so how do we measure this? We can do, I think there's a standard protocol in human surveys for doing a follow-up intensive survey where you try to get 100% response. For the hunting and fishing survey, that used to mean actually going door to door for the census. They go door to door, calling people on the phone. It's very, very expensive, in the millions, and we don't have the budget for that. What you do is you're able to compare the did not hunt and hunted rates, or actually the harvest, between the people who responded right away and those who didn't respond until the follow-up survey, and you can tell if your bias is there. I did a pilot follow-up survey. I started one. I surveyed 10,000 non-respondents this summer in 10 states. Those were the states with the biggest discrepancies that we saw in harvest estimates. I did that by email. I sent out 3 follow-ups. My response rate was nowhere near 100%, and our budget did not allow us to send out paper invitations for that. And so that was a pilot to see what kind of response rate we could get. Not a lot of effort involved. And we got some interesting results, but again, not anywhere near 100%. So what I just want to close with is some work that I've been doing this fall. And when you think about what a follow-up intensive survey entails, it's usually something where you're sending out a survey that follows the general survey, and you're trying to get 100% of all the hunters to answer and tell you about their hunting activity the previous year. All right, so that to me sounds like HIP, right? So every year the states spend a lot of time and money to survey hunters, and it's mandated for all hunters who want to hunt migratory birds to answer questions about what they hunted, how they hunted the previous year. And so I thought maybe we can use the information from HIP and compare it to the respondents and non-respondents in the previous year's survey and get a better idea of how the survey response differed from the HIP response in terms of respondents versus non-respondents. So here what we're doing is I'm just comparing, the circles are survey respondents. So people who answered the survey, what was the proportion of active hunters that we got? And this is everyone. Oh, and also I had to match up hunters because it's a whole new year of HIP. So you might have been Jimmy last year, and then you're James and the next year. And so there's a little bit of art to matching up hunters from one year to the next. But the circles are survey respondents. That comes right from our survey. And the diamonds are the HIP answers of the non-respondents. So they didn't respond to our survey, but then they registered to hunt the following year, and they told the state what they actually did. And the interesting thing here to compare is that they're different, first of all. So our response rates, and this is not last year, right? Because we haven't gotten the HIP data yet. This is 2022. That was the first year of the online survey compared to 2023 HIP. Right? I can do it for this year, but not until we get the HIP data that's coming in this hunting season. But there is an offset. So it appears that our survey respondents underestimate or do not have the same, have a lower proportion of active hunters than the people who did not respond to our survey last year. So let's say I do this again once I have a full year of HIP to compare. And if we are able to show that this is flipped, that something that we did, maybe the end of season reminders or the changes to the account login, made it more likely for hunters who did hunt to respond, we could see these two, the circle and triangle, flip and show some evidence that non-response bias has changed. And so I've been working on this for a while, and this is in no way operational, but it's just to look at the potential for HIP to provide an independent source of information that we might be able to use in a way that helps us understand non-response bias. So next steps, and I'm sorry, I hope I didn't run over my time, but there obviously is a need to do something a little bit more formal, evaluating non-response bias and other sources of bias for this survey. There's also the ongoing need to resolve some of the issues between state surveys and the harvest estimates from my branch. And I'm going to let Brad talk a little bit more about opportunities with a multi-state grant to accomplish that. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to hear them. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. That was very informative. Before we get to Brad, let's just pause and see if anybody has any questions regarding Kathy's presentation. So questions for Kathy. Kathy, I have one for you. How has the overall response rate prior to the online implementation, how does that compare to the new online implementation? Have the overall response rates changed, or is it more complex and a comparison isn't possible?
Well, it is complex, but the overall response rates have dropped with the online survey. We were at around 30% higher for, woodcock. I think the lowest was can't remember which one. They're all pretty close, and then like cranes and woodcock were pretty high. It's now around 20. We're up about 25% response rate, which is actually really way too low for a survey like this. And that allows for, it doesn't automatically mean there's non-response bias, but it definitely allows for that, and it could be exacerbated by that.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. I see Nate has his hand up. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, Kathy, just quick question on Atlantic Flyway's in the middle of that, evaluating the increased bag limit on hooded mergansers. And I didn't expect it to change harvest much, but is there going to be any way to kind of draw back on that old time series in the middle of this? Or I suspect the answer is no, but I mean, is there any way that we can kind of compare things, or is it just kind of we got what we got now?
Yeah, so if I don't know if you remember, but I did present the results of that 3-year comparison that we did for ducks and doves, and it did not show this big change. So that was in 2022. That was the first year of the full survey. We did not even see this big swing. So it was definitely something that's happened in between 2022-23 and 2023-24. My thought is that, and this has happened in the past and has happened with other surveys, is if you can conduct an evaluation and you find evidence of bias, then it's possible to measure it. And if you can measure it, then you can create, a correction factor for it to use for those kinds of applications, like if you really do need the whole time series. And we have that from the old male questionnaire survey to HIP. We're not there yet, so we don't have anything that we can use right now.
Sure. Thanks.
Other questions for Kathy? Okay, Kathy, I guess I have one more before we turn over to Brad here. So thinking about how HIP is used and the potential implications of these higher estimates, have you had any discussions with Scott Boomer about how this might affect mid-continent mallard AHM, for example?
Right. Well, after we did most of our checking, obviously we consulted with the other folks in our division who are primary users of the data, and explained what was going on. And the general consensus was that this is a large national survey. There were some pretty serious perturbations of the survey in the past couple of years, and it's unfortunate, but it's possible that they had caused a disruption in the time series. I'm not going to say that the estimates now are correct and the old ones were not correct, but it's almost something that is unavoidable in a sense. And again, it goes back to our decision to improve wherever we could. So yeah, I mean, Scott's aware of this, and the species-specific estimates are obviously not just dependent on the duck harvest estimate, but they're also highly dependent on the PCS. And when you look at the species-specific time series, if you do, and I actually have those plotted if anyone's interested, they're not predictable because there is a lot of variability in the PCS. So you don't just see a huge swing in all the duck estimates, duck species estimates. And it's sensitive to the state PCS survey. There's a lot of things that go into that. So in a sense, there wasn't a very large increase in the species that he pulls in harvest data for the strategy. So I'm not sure what the mid-continent, because that's a lot of different pieces of information, right? That's not just, in fact, for mid-continents, I'm not sure I think he uses harvest rates, but for scaup, pintail, western mallards, I don't know about eastern mallards, they pull in the harvest estimates, and they did not necessarily show the huge swing. Sorry, that's a long-winded way of answering that.
Well, it's complicated. So thank you. This was a very informative presentation. Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks.
Brad, are you with us?
I am. I thank you for having me. I haven't been sharing my video because I'm in a pretty remote area in Montana with not a very good cell service. So I was hoping to just present to all of you by audio without having to look at me. But thank you for having me. Two things I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about of the HIP communication strategy that we've been going through and where we are at with that. It's the grant is wrapping up on October 31st. We have working with Ducks Unlimited have reached out to a number of national media outlets, regional hunting retailers, other NGOs and conservation organizations and magazines. I'm not sure if you have seen it, but it's been, the messages and images have been out in a whole variety of different places, such as the Rough Grouse Society, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, National Association of Conservation Districts, NRA got it out. We also republished my article from the Ducks Unlimited magazine and the Wildlife Professional to get out to the professional community about the importance of HIP. Delta's put out information, been out in Wildfowl magazine, Retriever Journal, of huntinglife.com, a number of different print and also of social media posts. So hopefully hunters are seeing that message. I have asked in all 4 flyways for states that used any of the images or information for information about what they used, what feedback they've got. And then for those states that didn't use the information, any feedback you have for me about whether or not your communication folks didn't want to use it, or the format that was provided was too difficult to manipulate. The idea was that all those images would be easily edited, and that you could drop your agency logo in there if you don't call HIP, but you call it something else, that you could do that. I know, a few states like Washington, they call it migratory bird authorization. They use the messages, they change the language, put in their own picture, but they published it in the Regs Journal, and a number of other states did that as well. So for any of you who have information you'd like to share with me, I won't take time today to hear it necessarily, but please let me know so I can put it in the final report for the multi-state grant. Any feedback you want to share or questions right now, that I'm more than happy to answer those. But otherwise, since we're wrapping up Kathy's conversation about non-response bias, I wanted to talk a little bit about what might be the next steps in another multi-state grant to kind of get at that. So before I jump into that, are there any comments or questions about the HIP communication?
Any comments for Brad? Please go ahead. We used it in Iowa, Brad, and I appreciated it. It was good timing for our HIP transition as we changed our registration process in Iowa. So thank you for your effort.
Well, I thank all of you and all the flyways for supporting the effort. We're hoping to provide some tools that will be timely and useful for all of you. And hopefully we'll move the needle a little bit on hunter understanding about HIP. And it probably provides a good segue to talk about comparison of state harvest surveys and the federal harvest survey, which we talked about at the winter meeting. I wasn't able to follow up with any other flyway until the summer meetings, and we did talk to the Central Flyway about that. Kathy gave a very similar presentation, and they're very interested in joining an effort to look deeper into the federal harvest survey estimates and also some of the state harvest estimates that are coming from state surveys. So we discussed that more at the HIP working group meeting at AFWA, and Ken Richgis was there along with Karen from Ducks Unlimited, the chair of the HIP working group, and a number of other folks. And we did discuss, that this seems to be a pretty high priority, is digging into non-response bias and the varying estimates that we're getting. I did talk a little bit about the possibility that we could put together a multi-state grant proposal that would satisfy their strategic priorities and also allow us to begin looking at non-response bias. But I asked for some help there, and Mike Brazier agreed to try to help out and putting together a group so we could formulate a proposal, run it by the flyways at the winter meeting, and hopefully next year, the next funding cycle for multi-state grants would be in about a year, but we would have to go clear it through the approval process, which would start, with getting the endorsement by the flyway councils in the March meeting, and then approval at AFWA and the multi-state grant process next June for funding, would probably of January of 2026. So at the moment, we've been brainstorming. I'd like to put together a group to put together a proposal. And I know Mike's on if he has other comments or suggestions. But there's some of us who are committed to help working on this to if there's a great enough desire and need from the flyways.
Brad, I can chime in a little bit here. Timing is good, and I'll also share a little bit of this because I know at least one of you saw the recent posting on Afton's listserv for our next round of conservation science assistants here at national headquarters, and in that description was mention of we anticipate at least one of these people providing some near-term added capacity to this issue, helping to begin maybe assembling data sets, maybe doing some data analysis, working with Kathy and others, and Brad and state partners, so that we don't have to wait a year and a half or so to at least start making some movement on this. And the reason we are kind of offering that, we think there's an opportunity for that, is that we have just been, I would say, fortunate to connect with a person that is pretty qualified, unusually qualified for someone that would be applying for this 12-month position. Actually spoke with her this morning and made an informal sort of verbal offer, and she has accepted. And so she's going to be a forthcoming master's graduate from Auburn University and has a fair bit of quantitative skills, and has really, really impressed us the two times that we've met with her. And she is excited to contribute to this effort in any way that she can. Told Kathy in an email a couple of days ago that I anticipate this person, if everything works out, working hand in hand with her and others to make any kind of movement here in the near term that we possibly can. Some of it may relate to doing some actual data analysis of the type that Kathy has has talked about and wanting to do. Some of it may be related to providing some capacity to help write this grant and coalesce partners around it. So the most important thing is a very competent person will be joining us here and will be providing some added capacity to this question in one way or another. At least that is our expectation. This will be a collaborative effort, so we still have a few things to go through there, but that's kind of where we are.
Thanks, Mike. So, Oren, that's kind of where we're at. I wasn't sure how fast to blast through this, but be open to discussion and thoughts from all the members of the committee, and really look forward to trying to dig into this a little bit deeper and see if we can chart a path forward so we can investigate a little bit more about hunter attitudes and how they're participating with the harvest surveys.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that update, Brad. This is an exciting development. I'm glad to hear that this is getting some traction and is a priority. And thank you, Ducks Unlimited, for jumping on this and making it a priority and taking action as well. So I think that's pretty exciting. Turn it over to see if any other tech reps have any comments, questions, etc. from Brad or from Mike. Okay, so Brad, maybe I'll ask you a question. What would be helpful to have from us? How can we engage and participate in this?
Well, I think that having a couple of people from the committee that would like to interface with Mike and myself, and his potential hire some designated folks from the tech committee would be great.
Okay, so you'd like to put a small working group together. Will this working group be specific to the Mississippi Flyway or be continental in scale to work towards the grant?
Well, we haven't worked through all the other flyways, but certainly the central is interested as well. I suspect the other two flyways will come along. Again, our idea is to have something that we can bring back to the tech sections for their winter meetings, so you can pass it on to council, and hopefully we can get council endorsement at the winter meetings, and that will help an awful lot get it on the radar screen for funding through AFWA.
Yeah, I thought that timeline sounded really good, actually. I mean, in terms of the flyway, you guys have clearly thought about the flyway process. I appreciate that, and I look forward to seeing more this winter. Perhaps in the meantime, in the next couple of weeks, how about I will work towards identifying maybe 2 volunteers from our flyway to work with you all? Would that be helpful?
That'd be great.
Okay, so we'll find 2 Mississippi Flyway tech reps to serve on this group, and then we'll plan to hear from you all with a formal proposal at our February meeting for council's consideration in March.
That's where I'm going. I hope that coincides with others on the tech committee, and those in the other flyways. But that's kind of what the roadmap that I put together in my mind.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll make a note and I'll send out an email to the tech reps, and we'll find a couple of volunteers to serve on that in the next couple of weeks here so that we can get that ball rolling.
Thanks, Doran.
Okay. Any other questions, comments on HIP for Brad and or for Kathy? Thank you both for coming. HIP is super important. I really appreciate your willingness to engage with us, and we will circle back and engage with you and participate in this group.
Thanks. We'll see you all.
Okay, let's move right along here to our next agenda item, Ariel and King Rails. And Ariel, don't feel like you're pinched for time here. We still have 45 minutes, and really I think we'll have Paul after you, and then just some discussion which may or may not get traction. So please take as much time as you had planned for.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm figuring this won't probably take more than about 10 minutes and then however many questions you all have. So, can you all see my screen?
Yep, what's good?
Okay, awesome. Appreciate the chance to share about this project with the tech section. I'm presenting today on behalf of Jess Novobilski, who some of you probably met at the summer meeting in Arkansas. Her last name recently changed, used to be Jess Schmidt. So Jess finished up her master's with myself and Caleb Roberts at the University of Arkansas this spring. And so I'm going to present some of the results from her master's research and then also give you all a little bit of an update on the next King Rail project that's coming starting in January. So Jess's work was focused at Choctaw West Wildlife Management Area in southeastern Arkansas. It's the spot in the blue circle here on the map. And so this is the only site in the state of Arkansas that is known to have multiple breeding pairs of king rails. The other black dots on the map here represent other known king rail locations during the breeding season in 2017. Choctaw West is a pretty unique wildlife management area. Jason, who is the manager there, has spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to create a really heterogeneous emergent marsh, and the king rails really seem to love it. And so Caleb and I were awarded a state wildlife grant through AGFC to bring on Jess and do 2 years of work for Jess's project. And her work focused on 2 questions. One is focused on where across the WMA are king rails placing their nests. And then we also tagged individuals to look at migratory connectivity. And we'll talk about both of those today. We're going to start with nest site selection. Across the 2 field seasons, Jess found 26 king rail nests. These were found through a combination of searching randomized plots and then also going out and specifically looking for nests in areas where she and her technician were hearing king rails on the WMA. We found that doing more targeted nest searching was far more effective for king rails than random searching. I think in part, even though there are a lot of king rails at Choctaw, it's not coded in them. And so then when we did find nests, we would collect habitat information at the place where the nest was located and then at some randomly selected areas in the relative vicinity so that we could compare what was used to what was available in a habitat selection framework. I'm not going to go deep into the statistics, but if you have questions about that, I'm glad to answer them. Broadly speaking, we developed a set of models and through AIC model selection, ranked those models, and then we used model averaging to determine which of these habitat variables was an informative predictor of habitat selection. The way that this graph works is that things that are to the right of the red dashed line are positive selection, so things that are being selected more than they are available on the landscape. Things that are to the left of the dotted line is negative selection, so things that are being selected less than they are available on the landscape. And if the line for that variable overlaps the dotted line, then we didn't find any selection. And so we found positive selection for percent rush, and then also positive selection for average vegetation density, which if you're familiar at all with the king rail literature, which is not vast, but does exist, it won't be too much of a surprise to hear that king rails are putting their nests in dense places that are made up out of rushes. Perhaps the more surprising result here is that we didn't find any selection for water depth. That was really surprising to us. We kind of had expected to find that. That may be confounded by the fact that in 2023, which was Jess's second field season, it was very, very dry in southeastern Arkansas. So broadly speaking, king rails are selecting for areas with more rush cover when they're placing their nests. These are the 2 species that Jess found were the most commonly selected for by king rails, and then average vegetation density is also higher at nest sites. And so this is all about, we think, creating that vertical structure and protective structure to both protect the nests potentially from discovery by predators and also from weather events. We didn't have any evidence of selection for water cover or depth, which is quite different than some other studies have found, but that may be a result of the drought that we had in 2023. Looking at king rail movement, when we designed this project, one of the things we really wanted to try to better understand was whether the king rails that were at Choctaw are resident or migratory or some combination thereof. And so if you look at these two maps, I realize the one on the right is very fuzzy, but my hope is that you can kind of see, looking back and forth, that these range maps are really different. And pretty much any range map that you pull up for king rail is going to define the breeding area where it's proposed that there are migrant individuals versus the year-round range in slightly different places. And so on some maps, southeastern Arkansas is considered a year-round resident location, but on many maps it's not. And we really didn't know where exactly this fell out. And so Jess went out and caught quite a few king rails, and we put on Argos pinpoint tags. And we programmed them to give us data over the following about 10 months so that we could see whether or not the individuals that were there during the spring and during the summer were fully resident or whether they were migratory. So Jess caught and tagged, she caught more than 23, but we tagged 23 king rails, 8 in 2022 and 15 in 2023. About half of those tags were still sending us data back by the fall. Unfortunately, that just seems to be the way that a lot of these tags work, is you put out a bunch of them and don't get data back from quite a few of them. Of the 11 birds that the tags were still working the fall after the bird was tagged, only 2 of them migrated. The rest of them stayed either on the WMA or within a couple of miles. And the ones that did leave the WMA and stayed in the general vicinity very frequently returned to the WMA. So we had 1 bird that migrated in each year. So one of those was in 2022, where the bird left in late November and went down to around Delhi, Louisiana. And then in 2023, we had a bird that left in late June and went down to Atchafalaya National Wildlife Refuge. 2023, you'll remember, was the very dry year. And so while we don't normally think of king rails migrating in late June, that could be potentially a response to the drought or to a nest failure. We're really not sure. We also saw some interesting differences in the daily movements of our residents. So this is not including any of the movements of our migratory birds. The y-axis is average daily movement distance in meters, and then the months of the year are on the x-axis. And we see that in 2022, we kind of see what we would expect, right? The daily movement distances are like pretty small in the spring and the early summer when we expect that these birds would be nesting, and then it gets bigger as the season goes on. You know, king rails, the young leave the nest really soon after they hatch. And so as the season goes on, we would expect those birds to be making bigger and bigger movements. And then eventually, you know, get into the fall and they're no longer kind of tied to their broods. We did not see that pattern at all in 2023. Again, this could be drought related. Also, this is only 2 years of data, so it could also just be an artifact of maybe there were other things contributing to that, but we definitely saw some differences in daily movement distance. And so all of this together has really helped us to kind of, you know, just really kind of document what we, broadly speaking, already knew, which is that we have king rails at Choctaw West. They are breeding and they are nesting successfully. And most of them are residents, which is not what I would have predicted, but is congruent with at least some of the maps that are out there. And I think is also just really interesting. Like if we look over to the East Coast, the line between resident and migratory seems to fall a little bit further north up the East Coast. And we don't know exactly what drives that difference. It may have something to do with winter severity or something else. So based on kind of the results that were coming out of Jess's project, we now have another project that is about to get started. Caleb Roberts and myself are interviewing candidates for the master's position just this past week. So this student will start in January. There'll be 2 field seasons, and we're going to kind of build off of Jess's questions and kind of take them to an additional level of detail. So the main one is going to be looking at the drivers of nest success and how that is related to water level management and predator communities. So we're going to be putting these little cameras on the nests to see what what predators are coming in and at what stage and what might be causing nest failures, and see if we can relate that to water level management. One of my previous students did a similar study on least bitterns here in Illinois and found that water level management really influenced the predator communities coming into least bittern nests. And so we'll see if the same holds true for king rails. And then we're also going to be tagging juveniles. So one of our big assumptions when it comes to king rails is that the young of a resident or a migratory pair of king rails will have the same strategy as their parents. But we don't actually know if that's true. And so we know that most of the king rails at Choctaw are residents. We're going to tag a bunch of juveniles and see what they do. We're not necessarily expecting that they're all going to stay at Choctaw, but if after they disperse, if they set up and they stay resident, or if they become migratory, I think that'll be really interesting. There's also some conversations happening across the flyway on how we can work together on king rail questions. There's some real interest from the Lower Miss joint venture. And then also, Paul Link and Richard Temple have been doing some really cool king rail work in Louisiana. And then Brendan Shirkey at Winus Point has been involved with quite a bit of king rail work. And so we've had a couple of conversations. We have another one coming up here in the next couple of weeks. And so if you haven't been a part of that, but would like to be a part of seeing how we can potentially work together to answer some king rail questions flyway wide, please let me know. Glad to include you in that. And of course, big thanks to the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for funding Jess's project and the project that is still coming. And I'm very glad to take any questions.
Thanks, Ariel. Questions?
Ariel, your two maps that you had back there, I guess that's a little, I guess the one on the right is kind of the one I'd always sort of lived with, but I don't know, the one on the left seems to make more sense these days, I guess. Are you guys, I'm just trying to remember, Illinois, do y'all have king rails? Are you seeing, we used to have a pair kind of in central Kentucky that nested every year, and they seem to have gone by the wayside. I don't know how much more. You just mentioned Ohio. Are there other nesting groups farther north? What that left map shows?
Yeah, so I mean, there are certainly king rails kind of across the southern part of the Great Lakes states. There's not a ton of them, but they are there. There's a fair number kind of in western Lake Erie Basin. There's a few here in Illinois. Certainly a few in Missouri. I'm less familiar with what might be going on in Minnesota and Wisconsin with regard to king rail. So there are some, but it's certainly nowhere near the abundance that we see, say, in Louisiana or other places along the Gulf Coast or something.
Very cool stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else for Ariel? Yeah, I agree. Neat presentation.
Yeah.
Interesting birds. Thanks.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, we'll keep rolling right on here. Paul, are you still with us?
I sure am. Yep.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't really prepare a whole lot here. Is there anybody on the call today that didn't get the preseason banding report that would like it? If not, I guess shoot me an email if you'd like to see it or not. But yeah, it was definitely our best banding season. I don't know how many years I've been coordinating this now, 12 or 13. Just shy of 12,000 birds. Certainly one of the hardest working crews we've ever assembled. Big thanks to everybody that helped identify those people, particularly JB with Jillian. She was a great find, great worker up there.
She had the time of her life, it sounds like. So thank you and everybody up there.
And I guess that kind of leads into, I guess, where we should probably focus the majority of our time for this call is staffing. I plan on giving a more in-depth, in-person overview of, what we banded and all the things that worked and didn't work in person in Orange Beach. But I think talking about the staffing might be worth talking about a little bit here, as a couple states are on the hook for sending people. I'd again urge folks, especially the folks that are just sending crew members, to either, work through, chains like JB did, finding Jillian, finding a grad student that has that 50 or 60-day period open, to try to send folks like that. Um, Again, trying not to throw mud on anybody here, but those grad students go up there with a totally different mindset than your average, mid-career state biologist. They go up there, wanting to work hard, work long hours, get a lot of skills, meet a lot of people, network. So I encourage folks that are on the upcoming list to try to follow that model. If you can't find people in your state, again, we've worked through several of these in recent years where we've hired someone, on behalf of your state. So if you wanted to pay a stipend to the flyway, and we would in turn, advertise and hire. I've been talking with a handful of the profs in our flyway, particularly like Doug Osborne and Brad Cohen, who have a lot of grad students. A lot of them are fairly experienced banders, that would, gain a whole nother skill set if they could go on behalf of, state folks. I'd like to continue keeping that kind of hybrid staffing going, where we're kind of, training and recruiting the next generation of waterfowl biologists, as well as really encourage folks to think hard and long about who they send. If you are sending a state biologist, make sure they know that it's not a 40-hour week or a, an 8-hour day, that they're going to have to be really flexible, and they're going to have to, work weird hours throughout the week. And I guess we can, does anybody have any other questions about staffing for 2025? Tentatively, we have Missouri and Arkansas sending the crew leader and assistant crew leader. And then, as we mentioned, in our August meeting, whether or not we can find students that can go as the crew members for each of these crews, or whether we want to just go on a rotation with states. And if we do go on rotation with states, whether or not we double them up, if we try to send 2 Missouri people and 2 Arkansas people together, or whether we want to have a more frequent rotation where states are on, about every 5.5 or 6 years. Again, we don't need to make a decision on that here today. We've thankfully got, many months to help work out staffing for 2025, but those are a couple of the scenarios that we'll be talking about in future months about how to put together 4, potentially even 5 crew members to be sending up for the 2025 season.
Paul, I had a
Yep.
question on that.
Yep.
I thought Iowa was on the hook for a 25 crew member.
Yep.
Is that still the case?
Yep. That is your placeholder on the schedule right now. 2025 will be the last year, as currently designed, where, again, talking with a handful of states, they would prefer to send 2 people at a time. So yeah, the crew members for next year, it just worked out that Missouri and Iowa were the 2 states sending single year crew members, with Missouri
So
again.
Missouri's on the hook to send 2 people simultaneously.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think Reed's on today, but we had many discussions up there for the couple weeks I was banding with those guys, and he thinks he could make it work. And in the meantime, if there are other states that have an identified person that might be early in their career, that might not have commitments and family issues, if they would want to bump ahead, there's nothing saying we have to stick to the schedule. It was literally just randomized, picking an order for states to go. So if anybody has people that want to go or can go, we can certainly rearrange you, send you sooner, and bump your place in line, much later down the list. But that's what our 2025 staffing looks like, is currently with Missouri and Arkansas as crew leader and assistant crew leader respectively, and then Missouri and Iowa as crew members.
I need to begin the process of selecting a crew member pretty quickly. So I would feel better about beginning that before the winter meeting, Paul, or is your guidance to wait until the winter meeting?
No, if you think you have the person and the political willpower to put someone together, let's go ahead and plan on Iowa sending someone.
Okay.
Hey, Paul, I got a question for you. This is JB.
Yep.
So being that Dave has ruined our meeting schedule, we could never go, most of us could never go and help you, but now who knows when we're going to be having our fall meeting. Do you have capacity to, if some of us who couldn't previously go want to come for a couple weeks to put us somewhere? I mean, not as a full crew member, but to come help some. Is there ability to do that, or are y'all space limited?
It depends on how prima donna you are. We do have fairly limited bunk space, especially at Sand Lake and Jay Clark, depending on what kind of fire season they're having. When I'm up there, I'm often throwing up a tent out in the yard because I usually have my dog with. Chris Nikolai roughs it pretty hard too, either sleeping in his truck or popping a tent up. But yeah, as I mentioned before, I'd love to see us put together like a Google document or something with a calendar and get a rotation and try to get as many of you up there as you can. Just that time of the year and the extent between Sand Lake, Arrowwood, and Jay Clark. It's 5.5 hours from north to south to drive among the three, and the landscapes and the water conditions and the production. I mean, it's all highly variable. I think it's a very worthwhile experience for anyone that has the interest. Especially if you're just thinking a handful of days at each one. There are towns within 20 to 30 miles of all the places. If you would want to get a hotel, that's certainly we can make it work in the field. We'd love to have help. Those of you that have operated on rocket ending crews know you can't do it with just a 2-person crew. Having that third or fourth extra person there can make or break days. So yeah, if you don't mind staying on a couch or being fairly crunched for space with the crew, we'd love to have as many of you that can come.
Awesome. We'll look into that because all of a sudden our summer's a little bit more open than it used to be.
Yeah, and one of the bigger logistical things that I'm going to be working on here over the next few months is I'm probably going to go up for the first 2 weeks next year, as opposed to the last 2.5 or 3 weeks like I've been doing. And most of that is because I think I can do a lot more benefit to the crew to be there for training at the beginning, knowing that we're going to have a much less skilled crew this year than we did, having Dave Brandt and Reed and Jeffrey up there. So I'm hoping that'll pay off, get the crew doing things right from the start. I've also had a handful of conversations with Mark Grovedon and Rocco Morano in South Dakota and Szymanski, Tom Cooper, and a handful of other folks about opening that, banding season with like a 2 or 3 day workshop where we invite some of those other banding crews over. One of the things Orrin had asked a couple of weeks ago was about the proportion of the birds that our crews band, and I put those numbers together. I've got them to share here, and it's pretty eye-opening. How many birds we band. The proportion. I don't know if I can share my screen here, but are you all able to see this?
Yep, I can see it, Paul. Seen a
Okay.
spreadsheet.
Yeah, so this is a reference area 13 for which our 3 banding stations in Sand Lake, Arrowwood, and Jay Clark. Here's our contributions down in the lower right for the number of birds that our 3 flyway stations band in total proportion for reference area 13. Just for the the top 6 species there, obviously mallards and pintails kind of tell the whole story there. Kind of scary to think that without our effort, there wouldn't be very many pintails banded in banding reference area 13. And it's even uglier if you go down to the, guess I can't scroll down to it. Can you all still see this for reference area 12?
Yes.
Okay, so again, just 2 banding stations there, Medicine Lake, and then Tom Cooper goes to Crosby Wetland Management District, and again, that's the totality of the birds banded in that reference area: 132 mallards and 39 pintails. So again, by hopefully having a couple day workshop. Hopefully we can improve banding efficiency. I learned some pretty unique information in discussions with Deb Carter. She's the SQUIDUS lady that comes and does the bleeding. She's been to a couple of our meetings with us before. Again, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but she was really enlightened by what she saw out there after being with our crews for a couple of weeks. I think there's a lot of efficiencies that we can work on. Again, more of tooting the horn of our crews than trying to throw anybody under the bus right now. But again, just like to again brag on our crews for how hard they worked and their accomplishments. About 84% of all the birds that our crews banded were the 2 priority species for mallards and pintails. So.
Yeah, I see it as a tremendous success, Paul. I really do. I think it's a great year, and you're doing a great job coordinating this. Has this been shared with council directly, Paul? I was thinking that we should definitely do so if we haven't yet.
I don't believe it has.
Okay. I'd be happy to be the intermediary there and share the report and a little bit, just a quick highlight with council's chair so he can distribute. And I think that would be appropriate given the recent funding approval and increase, just to show that it's hopefully going to provide future fuel to this very successful program.
Okay.
Kind of circling back to what you teed up earlier, Paul, about, I think what you were trying to get conversation on was, should the flyway continue to send a 3rd and 4th crew member from different states, or should we change the level of commitment for the states that are on the hook for the leader and assistant leader to also include crew members? Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. So I think that's a really important discussion that needs to be had. And I guess I need to short circuit that discussion, given that I was on the hook for 25. I guess I would ask you as banding committee chair, do you want to have that at an in-person meeting this winter, or are you seeking to get that tied up before the winter meeting?
I think we can do it before the winter. I typically don't need to start working on permit amendments, and have the person identified and have their banding resumes until March or April. So
Okay.
I would still have plenty of time. Again, I just want everybody thinking about that, with how their travel authorizations work. Be thinking about, who they have on staff that they could be sending. If they do want to, work on hiring people, obviously we'd want to start that process, a little earlier than March, give us time to reach out across our networks. Again, Brad and Doug both sounded like they would more than likely have either a student or a combination of students that would really like the experience, to get to go work on a banding crew. If they have a good enough resume to potentially even function as a crew leader or assistant crew leader, it's obviously a great resume builder for them, and gets them a lot of skills, that they wouldn't otherwise have. And again, I have a really good track record of these grad students going up there with having something to prove, and their work ethic and the way they ask questions. I'm really impressed with a lot of these, young guys and gals that we've sent up there. So I'd like to try to keep it going, where we have some kind of hybrid of sending state biologists, again, mostly because of the vehicle that comes along with. That's the big, most important part about having a state person is that they come in their work trucks, with their gas cards. So certainly need to keep that in mind. It'd be great to keep 2 state biologists on the hook to have their vehicles there. And I know Reed in particular, he walked into this position and then became Missouri's waterfowl program manager, at the beginning of the season, or got offered the job in the middle of the season. And he's going to have some comments on the Missouri model of sending 3 people up there, and he's not going to encourage that going forward because of the the turnover and the amount of training that it takes and how disruptive it was on crew cohesiveness. So I'd like folks to be kind of thinking about that as you identify people too, that sending people up for 2.5 weeks, it seems like a good idea, but it was rough on the crew this year. Both Jeffrey and Reed did not appreciate having to retrain folks every couple weeks. And again, sometimes you have a hard worker and you hate to see him go, and other times they were very excited that someone's time was running up. So again, we just need to do a really good job making sure the people that are going understand exactly what they're getting into. And I thought that everybody did this year, but one of them didn't. We just were able to make it work. Thankfully, it was at the beginning of the season, and things were a little bit slower than normal, but it still got a little tense for Reed and one of his crew members up there. So just make sure people understand that this is a a strong back, weak mind type position, that they're going to be hauling lots of bait. You're going to have to be able to lift a a protein lick or a garbage can full of barley in and out of the pickup and carrying them up and down banding sites and moving crates full of birds around. It's a pretty physically demanding job to be on the crew. Not necessarily showing up to help for a couple of weeks. Obviously, any of you guys would be more than welcome to come help, no matter your physical capabilities. But the dedicated crew, they need to be able to to lift 50 to 75 pounds, and it's unfair to the rest of the crew if they can't. So be thinking of that type of stuff when you're identifying people.
Well, Paul, maybe just some initial feedback, I would say. It sounds like manpower is one of our limitations on this crew. I totally understand the hesitations about relying on states to send people, but if manpower is our limitation, I would be hesitant to back off on the state's obligations to send people. But maybe at the same time, we can double down on encouraging the academic involvement through grad students too.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely want to keep at least 2 state biologists, one each for Jay Clark and Arrowwood for their trucks. And then if the states, I know it would pencil out better for them to hire, a student technician or a grad student technician than it would be to send, a classified full-time employee. So again, we can discuss the options. If the state has the people and interest and vehicles and they can send 2 per year, great. But if not, we have lots of options to make sure that the crews are fully staffed and able to do their jobs. And that said, too, also need to do a big shout out to the refuges themselves. Thankfully, we're well established up there now. We've got a great big network of people. There's extended family from folks that work on the National Wildlife Refuges where we are up there that come out and help. There's a handful of people in the Jamestown area that work in agronomy positions in Northern Prairie, and everybody's kind of got a pretty good list of contacts, and they're able to find people that'll come out and help on big catch days. And obviously to band 11,400 ducks among the crews, they had some big catches. I was up there for a couple double net sets with over 500 birds per catch, so can't do that with a 2-man crew. And again, big shouts out to the crowd, the crews and the refuge staff and the locals that have been helping these crews be safe and successful for the birds and the banding efforts.
It sounds like a tremendous success this year, Paul. Anybody else have questions, comments for Paul? Well, Paul, I think you brought up some pretty important topics for the banding committee to engage on, especially now that we've gotten the funding on a more secure footing. I think it would be good to try to secure the staffing as well. Perhaps that would help you as coordinator if you could have some consistency and firm commitments moving ahead.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Paul, and congratulations on a great season.
You bet. Thank you all.
Okay, so moving on in our agenda, as I mentioned, we're going to move our Iowa presentation to December. So we talked about the data book earlier in Dave Scott's Fish and Wildlife Service update. So I think that leaves the last agenda item is a discussion about the summer meeting. I asked last week for you all to consider this. And while you're all getting ready to share your input, a brief update is that council moved ahead on this item. They floated the idea of a bylaws change. If you remember at the summer meeting, they talked about a bylaw change to have the summer meeting begin the week after September 20 so that the report was available. Well, their initial idea was just to shift that back to September 5. However, several council members expressed hesitation about that bylaw change, and instead they went ahead and voted on the dates for 2025 and 25 only, with the idea of tabling a longer term solution until they've had a chance to engage with our group and perhaps circle back to it at a later time and approve it at their March meeting. That's my understanding, at least. So for 2025, the council meeting will be the week of September 8th. The calendar in 25 is a little interesting in that September 1st is Labor Day. So Labor Day is as early as possible. And then AFWA is a little, let's see, AFWA is a little later, I think. But the trouble is, with the timing, as Labor Day gets later in the year and AFWA floats in mid to late September, it's really difficult to find a time to consistently meet in September. So with that, I'll turn it over to seek TEP section input on thoughts when the GBTS and council should meet in September and October for 26 and moving forward. And even if you don't have a suggested date or rule or convention, I'd very much be open to suggestions as to how we should come to some sort of decision or consensus on this issue. How to approach it would be helpful, because I sure don't know either.
Hey, Oren, I've talked to you, I've talked to JB, talked a little bit to Brad. And, there's no perfect solution. And I know that council is trying to weigh their options. And I suspect you won't be able to easily word a bylaw change that, locks in a specific week. But I am pretty confident, after I talked to, Ken on behalf of you guys of when we should be done by in terms of having recommendations to go to SRC, kind of the no later than mid-October was a general guidance at this point. And, the caveat that Fish and Wildlife Service, we still have relatively dysfunctional government in terms of getting budgets passed by October 1st. And when that doesn't happen, if we have the threat of a shutdown, that makes it very hard for us to travel in that early October timeframe. So it seems like trying to get this done in September makes the most sense from that perspective. And then you get into the, when is the timing of the AFWA meeting? And it obviously affects council much more than tech section members and others. So they don't want to have a meeting where, they come in for Thursday, Friday to do business and instantly leave to go to AFWA. But on the other hand, if they come back from AFWA and they have a week off, then, they can show up easily for a following weekend of the week with us or vice versa. So I think there's a 1-2 week buffer in between the meetings possible and still kind of get our work done in the second, third, fourth week of September. I think there's a way to do it. It's not ideal. And as JB has said, occasionally we'll have the 5th being on a Friday or Saturday and not a lot of time to look at things. But we've been in that mode for a long time. I think in general, you're at least going to have a few more days to look at reports and recommendations before showing up at the meeting with some type of September timeframe. But as long as I can travel, I'll be there whenever you guys have the meeting.
Hey, Oren, I've obviously has talked to Dave about this some, thought about it a lot. I don't have an immediate good solution. I absolutely hate the idea of that every year we're going to have a different location, a different timing of the meeting, the first week of September, last week of September, whatever. That is terrible for me. I mean, I have a lot of kind of, forgive me if the right word is power in that this is when the flyway meeting occurs. Don't plan other things then. And if we change every year, that really makes our planning and our life hard. I don't know. Like I said, the reason we always fought for August is because that was the time when everybody was free and it worked. But I don't know. I think we're set for next year, but I think we need to have a bigger discussion. I mean, to me, I'm probably more lean towards October, first week of October. You're avoiding CFWA, avoiding AFWA, and then you just kind of deal with the consequence every 10 years that the government's shut down and we can't have a flyway rep there. I don't know. We'll see, I guess, but I would lean towards more a set date that isn't going to fluctuate every year.
So to cast some light on why AFWA is such a problem, I went back and looked at the prior 5 years of the meeting dates. The AFWA meeting has begun as early as September 8th, and it's concluded as late as September 27th. So it makes it really hard for us to avoid Labor Day and also avoid AFWA. And that's exactly why, I think that's why John favors October. All of us have different preferences to when this meeting occurs, but I think overall nobody's happy about this. Again, I would open up to if anybody has any feedback as to what your preferences are or how we should decide this. Part of me feels like council's the one with the AFWA conflict, so maybe council should just decide this. I don't know. I'm struggling with this one, looking for feedback from US tech reps.
If council decides that they're willing to entertain our recommendations and do it at a separate time from our summer meeting, then you could lock in, this second week or whatever, third week of September and have the meeting. And then it's going to be up to them to figure out where and when they're going to meet to take action. But I know we have things figured out for next year, which is good. And my suggestion to council at this point, maybe you can make this through Todd as our MFC rep. All the flyways are affected by the date. All the flyways are affected by dealing with AFWA for their council members. Is that maybe the NFC, either between cycle or between now and the March meeting, needs to put their heads together and see if they can come up with some suggestion options that the councils can consider.
I really hate that idea, Dave, because their decision will be, we'll have our meeting, the tech sections can meet whenever they can, and we'll just do just like the North American will meet, the councils will meet at AFWA, and then we lose all contact with them. I don't know. I'm very concerned that that's what we're setting up with this. That, you know, last couple of meetings we've had fairly short. Get a council, like we came all this way for 3/4 of a day meeting. Could we just do this at AFWA, and we lose connection to them? And I just not a huge fan of that.
I get it, JB. I'm just offering suggestions because I don't want to have to travel to a separate meeting. I don't get permission to go to AFWA, so it makes it difficult. But, you know, to get to your point, if you want to lock this in, locking it in early October is also not good. So we got to find a solution, and I'm glad we have things kind of worked out for next year. That gives us some time, opportunity for everyone to talk to their council members, opportunity for council to talk among themselves and consider the best way forward.
Well, and maybe that's a good talking point, is how strongly do people feel about the potential for council to meet separately at AFWA? Is that just a non-starter for states, or is that something that in terms of efficiency we're willing to entertain?
I'm going to tell them, if they want that option on the table, that it's difficult for the flyway reps to get permission to go to AFWA. And so that's not an ideal situation, but, you know, we would ask if that's what all the flyways decide they want to do.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dave and John, for your input on this. Really haven't heard from anybody else. So I really don't know what to take back to council other than
Barb's here. She's the smartest one around. What does Barb think?
Oh, come on. Why do I get called on? I agree with JB though. I think that there's great value in having the council meet at the same time as the tech section, right? At least once a year. I do think there's tremendous value in that. And we are seeing, right, like I think a lot of council members disengaging. And I agree that having us meet separately from them in the summertime would likely just exacerbate that. I don't like that. I mean, that's the problem, right? I don't like any of the options. Early October is tough. I mean, our hunting season begins, the early October. And so there's a lot of conflicts there. So, I mean, my preference would be trying to find sometime in September that avoids the AFWA. I don't know if maybe we've got some of our council members that are connected well enough in AFWA. And again, like Dave said, this does impact all 4 flyways. Maybe there's a conversation to have with AFWA. Could we get them to commit to a certain meeting schedule so that we could easily plan the flyway council meetings around them? I don't know who that is, but it seems like somebody's probably got those connections, or at least that kind of influence to have that conversation with AFWA. I don't know exactly who sets those meeting dates for AFWA.
Well, the NFC is officially affiliated with AFWA, right? And
yeah.
So getting back to Dave's suggestion, if the NFC were to take this up, but the trouble is the NFC isn't going to meet until March, and that'll be after our Flyways winter meeting. So it'll put us it'll kick this can down the road for probably at least another year, which is less than desirable.
Yeah, and I'm sure AFWA has contracts for hotels for the next couple of years as they have locations, but for them to make a commitment in the future to lock in on a particular week, the people who can make that happen are the folks who can talk to Ron Reagan, the regional association people like Ollie and his counterparts that could have those kind of conversations. So I'm sure there's members of our council and the directors of their agencies who could decide if they want to push that.
Hey, we meet the earliest of all the flyways
in the summertime, right? So for the other flyways, apparently meeting in September isn't an issue. And so why is it an issue for us, but it might not be for one or two other flyways?
Well, this year, I think the Atlantic Flyway was the only flyway to meet in September. But to your point, I don't know why it wasn't an issue for the Atlantic Flyway. And how they, and maybe that's a question I can ask, is how they rotate or how they adjust their meetings with AFWA and with Labor Day. So good point, Jamie. I'll reach out to the Atlantic Flyway and see if they have a convention for how they set their meeting in September.
Just for the folks who didn't see, I talked to Kevin Cry and to Pacific Flyway, and they both sound like they're going to try to meet that the same week that we were talking about next year, but neither one of them kind of realized the AFWA problem the year after that. So the plan, I guess everybody's plan is to get through next year and then try to figure out a plan from there. Maybe for other people, it just isn't a big a deal to move it, have the moving dates, and maybe that's just the life we have. But it's nice for me to be able to lock a date in. And, you know, again, I'm not a huge fan of having it the day after we get reports, because, you know, we're not able to, you know, go through them as much as we would hope. But so be it. It is what it is.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to drag this out. Are there any other comments or input on this issue? It is an important one. All right. Well, I think we lost quite a few folks here. So with that, I think let's go ahead and consider adjourning. I'd take a motion and a second to adjourn.
Kentucky motion.
Thanks, John.
Michigan second.
All right. Thanks, Barb. Well, thank you all for hanging in there. Look forward to seeing you in a month.
Thanks, Oren.
Oren. Thank you.
See you guys.